Now, what I think is at work here, which I think is quite interesting, is the attempt to subvert that symbolic imaginary.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why this is dangerous is because, as I've argued in Living Forms of the Imagination and in other books, is that this symbolic imaginary is not just one imaginary alongside a lot of other possibilities.
Yeah.
It is ultimately grounded in truth.
Yeah.
And so I think part of the resistance is indeed Christian. I mean, it may be submerged, but I think it is linked to the public and financially supported attempt to subvert part of the Christian narrative.
All right. Well, I'm here with Dr. Douglas Hedley. I'm excited for this conversation because I have listened to the Exodus seminar thing that Jordan Peterson did for the Daily Wire, then the Gospels. And I felt like there were two people when I was listening to those that really stuck out to me. And everybody was great, by the way, but just two people that I felt like I resonated with most. And one of them was Dr. James Orr, which I think he's just a very smart guy, very interesting. And then you and him felt like, I don't know why, it just felt like you guys grounded the conversation maybe in a biblical interpretation that was more familiar to me. And maybe that's just a personal bias. I don't know, but I just felt like you guys were very interesting to listen to. And so here we are, Douglas Hedley. Thanks for coming on the podcast to talk. I want to talk first about a book that you wrote that I've been reading called Living Forms of the Imagination. I've got some specific questions about it, but before we get into those, can you kind of just give a brief overview as to what this book is about, maybe even why you wrote it?
Well, in a way, it emerged out of a book that I wrote about Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And that book itself emerged out of a tension between philosophy and theology that I'd experienced as an undergraduate. I read the Joint School in Oxford, in philosophy and theology.
Sure.
And at that time, the philosophy that I was studying was profoundly empiricist, analytical, and the theology was, I mean, there were many interesting theologians in Oxford at the time, but quite a lot of the theology was, let us say, of a sort of fairly hagiographical kind. So I felt as if I was caught between this very reductionistic, hard-headed, positivistic, empiricistic philosophy, which had very little space for religion, and a theology that in some respects was still rooted in the 19th century. And so I was looking for some way of combining or seeing a link between the philosophy and theology. And then at the very end of my time in Oxford, I came across Coleridge, a little book called Aids to Reflection. And I didn't understand this book at all, but I just had a sense that this was what I was looking for. And then I thought that, well, one of the elements missing in quite a lot of the secondary literature was the German background. So I decided to go to Germany and do my doctorate in Germany.
Wow.
And so I did that in Munich. Wow. And so what happened, that ended up being the thesis, and then that ended up being the book. And in the meantime, I got the job in Cambridge. And the Living Forms of the Imagination was an attempt to, on the one hand, escape from Coleridge, but do something Coleridgean. So it, in a way, it was an exploration of themes and ideas that had excited me in Coleridge, but without having to go through his marginalia or his notebooks or his letters or some of the unpublished works. So, and also it, I think, was partly an attempt to spread my wings. And as you know, I discuss Lewis and Tolkien and other figures who are associated with Coleridge, really, and I would see as part of a very similar tradition. So that's really the background to the book.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring up the disconnect between theology and philosophy. I mean, that's obviously one of the the first quote that I had pulled from your book, and you're talking about the concept of God, and you say, in the last few centuries, its scope and ambition have been severely restricted. Contemporary philosophers are often puzzled why God might be thought as a philosophical topic at all, transcending in the worst possible sense of the world, both reason and imagination, and providing a basis for superstition and delusion. That's one. I read that and I was like, yes, that's like what's happening. I just have felt that even on, I don't have PhDs or anything like that, just on the sort of general, level of just going through public school systems and talking to different people. There seems to be this assumption that theology and philosophy are completely disconnected, and that, religion is over here, and the study of how the world, philosophy is over here. And so I guess my question would just be, why is that concept of God not accepted in modern philosophy?
Well, I mean, that's I think a complex story, but one should say, first of all, that the concept of God is absolutely key for the Western philosophical tradition. And in fact, one might say that Western philosophy starts off with that question. I'll explain what I mean. So essentially, I tease my students by saying that Western philosophy starts off as a colonial enterprise, by which I mean the Greek colonies in what's now Italy and Turkey. So basically the Eleatic and the Ionian schools. So the Eleatic schools, so this is the schools at the school around what's now the south of Italy. So figures like Parmenides were representing, one might say, a top-down approach to philosophy, i.e. essentially theological approach. Xenophanes is another major figure here. And then the Ionians were representing the more, let us say, scientific approach or materialistic approach. So the idea that we find in, for example, in Heraclitus, or that everything is in flux, Pantare, or that sort of proto-scientific views about the nature of reality, and obviously critical of the traditional gods. Now, in a way, you could say that Plato and Aristotle were trying to mediate between these two positions, the Eleatic and the Ionian, i.e. the top-down and the bottom-up. And you could see the doctrine of the ideas, both in Plato and in Aristotle, as being part of this mediating maneuver. But what is clear is that the idea of God, and here we have to be a little bit careful because there's no exact correlate of the term God in Greek. The word the word theos has a broader meaning in Greek than it does in English. It's often predicative, so predicating a certain quality of life, a kind of level of being, rather than a personal name.
Interesting.
And so nevertheless, the idea of the divine and the philosophical significance of the divine as an explanatory principle is absolutely key to both Plato and Aristotle. That's inherited by the medievals, both in the Islamic world and, of course, in the Christian world. And I would say that's still absolutely key in modern philosophy. I mean, think about the early modern philosophers, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke. I mean, they all have concepts of God that are playing a very important role in their philosophies. So the idea that the Enlightenment or the early modern period is a period when God disappears is quite false. The Western philosophical tradition is theological from its inception. It remains theological throughout the medieval period. And even in the modern period, it's still very significant, despite a number of changes. I would say the real shift is occurring after the French Revolution and throughout the 19th century. So by the time in the West you get to the dreadful wars, I suppose including the American Civil War, but particularly the First World War, and then the Second World War, there's this, I think, crisis of confidence in the inherited Christian tradition. So how could countries that prided themselves on their cultural inheritance and congratulated themselves on being civilizing forces in the world, bringing Christianity, bringing universities, bringing hospitals to other parts of the world, could be destroying themselves and behaving as brutally as the European powers did in the First and Second World Wars. So I think that that cultural crisis, together with philosophical movements that were often linked to it, like positivism or post-structuralism, I think they reinforced this sense of cultural crisis.
So do you think, I mean, and I don't know, but this is interesting because when you think about the 19th century and the early 20th century, I mean, I think about the Industrial Revolution as well, which I think was an interesting time. And it seems like, so I read the book by Carl Trueman, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Have you heard of that or read that?
He was a colleague at one time. So before I came to Cambridge, I was in Nottingham for 5 months. I had a temporary job there, and because I was on a temporary position and Carl was on leave at the time, I was actually using his office space for a time.
Nice. Yeah. Well, that book opened my eyes to a lot. And I think one of the interesting things that I've heard is that during the Industrial Revolution, there is some sort of shift in the social imaginary in which the sort of assumed worldview was a mimetic worldview. And then through the Industrial Revolution, because we were deceptively taking raw material and creating whatever we wanted out of it, we sort of shifted into this poetic worldview, and which culminated in World War II dropping the bomb. That was that sort of like culminated God complex. I don't know that we created this bomb that could take out entire cities. I don't know, if I'm drawing too much from from that. But do you think that that shift that you're talking about had to do with sort of some of these technological advancements that happen so quickly in such a short amount of time that people in the world, in the West especially, just thought, well, the idea that we live in a mimetic world in which, nature governs us, that's just not true anymore. We've learned how to govern nature. We can kind of do what we want with things. And when nature doesn't impose itself on you, you don't necessarily have to, or you're not inclined to think that there's a God. Does that make sense? I hope that.
Yeah, I mean, this in a way is interesting. I mean, this is a sort of ancient mythos, really, which goes back to the book of Job.
Sure.
And in fact, Goethe's Faust. I mean, the figure of Faust in Goethe's play is a figure of of Luciferian control and exploitation.
Yes.
I mean, that ambition to become maître et possesseur de la nature, as Descartes puts it, to become masters and possessors of nature.
Yes.
Right. So I think my view is that the sense of the sacred is part of what it is to be a human being. So I accept, which I think is basically a Platonic view of figures like Mircea Eliade. I know he's not a very fashionable figure, but I'll mention him anyway. Of the idea of the human being as the homo religiosus, so that human beings are naturally religious.
Yes.
And by that I mean, I don't mean that human beings naturally, or all human beings are inclined to enjoy, an elaborate high mass or some bizarre ritual fasting structure or whatever. I just mean that this sense of the sacred, this awareness of holiness, is phenomenologically a part of human experience.
Yeah,
that totally is witnessed in the poetry, in the mythology, in the philosophy and theology of all the great cultures.
Yes.
And in fact, is probably more present in what we used to call primitive cultures than in the highly industrial societies of the West.
Yes.
That paradoxically, the great achievements of the West technologically, which have been remarkable and which I'm not...
They're allowing us to do this podcast right now.
Exactly. Yeah. Here am I, in Savannah, Georgia.
Yes.
As an Englishman, resident in Cambridge, in England, and you're in the Midwest, I believe.
Yes.
So this technology is great, but it has this collateral effect of divorcing human beings from a lot of these contexts which facilitate and reinforce this, I think, perfectly natural sense of the sacred. I mean, it's the experience we have, for example, when a child is born or when you lose a parent. I mean, a few years ago, I remember standing next to my mother as she was dying in hospital, and just that sense of, I'm waiting upon the person who brought me into the world, physically brought me into the world, and she's now dying. So that mystery of life, and the mystery of its beginning and its end. And my father and I were sitting, because she was unconscious at the time, and and presumably she couldn't talk because of the state she was in. And it was Holy Week. So I read the Book of Common Prayer, and of course, the sonorous beauty of the Book of Common Prayer seemed practically the only literature that I could turn to in that moment, or in those days, rather.
Yes.
And that's really what I mean by this sense of the sacred. I mean, I don't mean elaborate rituals or
Sure.
I mean a very primordial human sense that I think we all have in the presence of these moments of decisive moments of human life, and also when our eyes are open to some of the remarkable beauties and mysteries of our existence.
There's a quote as you were talking that I thought of by C.S. Lewis. I love it. It's very popular, but if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. Seems to encapsulate a little bit of that. And I think it's very interesting. And this is sort of, as I was writing out the structure for this interview, I wanted to, get to the point where we talk about what the future of the West is. But I think we're hitting on some of these points right now, because what you're discussing in this sort of natural religious desire, or whatever that would be called inside of every human person, there's this mystery that we can't, we don't fully understand everything. And moments like birth. I remember, we have 2 kids, and my wife's pregnant with our third, and it was only a couple of years. We've been married 3 years, so we're trying to repopulate the earth. And with my first son, I just had no clue what I was getting into when, with the actual giving birth part of things. And I remember being in the room watching this whole thing happen. And when he arrived, I was just crying. I couldn't, and I didn't know why. I was just crying. I just couldn't stop crying, because there was something that was about the whole act of giving birth that just seemed to me like way too, it escaped rationality. I don't know why. I just was crying, and it felt like a spiritual thing, and it felt, like, to me, evidence for the reality of Christ and of God, and it made sense of certain biblical passages, like women will be saved through childbirth. Like that sort of made sense to me when I saw my wife give birth. It's like it's a sacrificial, life-giving act. Of course, it's like the exact parallel to the Gospels, to Jesus Christ dying on the cross, giving life. So anyways, I totally understand, and that makes sense. When you disconnect these things, though, when you disconnect that sort of religious desire or whatever we want to call that from people, and I think we have in the West in education, we've disconnected that from education. And so a lot of young people are growing up in a world in which religion is looked at as an archaic, old, outdated thing. And that's what I grew up in. And I think the tides are turning a little bit now, but I grew up in that. It causes this weird internal chaos, this discontinuity I've noticed in myself growing up, where my parents are telling me Christianity is real. We're Christians. And then at school, I was being told Christianity is evil. It's wrong. It's bad. And it causes this really chaotic thing to happen inside of you. And I've seen this in a lot of my friends, where you feel like the Christianity thing is real, but you don't know how to reconcile it with the fact that all these authoritative figures in your life are telling you that it's wrong, it's evil, and it's bad. I don't know, how do you reconcile that societally? I know that we're talking, philosophy and theology, but how do you actually practically reconcile the fact that so many people, and I don't, sorry, this is a big question. So many people in the West, so many young people have grown up in this world of just discontinuity and chaos. They don't know what to think about the world. They don't know what to think about themselves. I hope that that's not too big of a question, but I'm interested in hearing your thoughts. Well,
perhaps there has been these periods of a sort of ebb and flow within Christendom.
Yes.
I mean, periods of an increase in skepticism, and then periods of revival.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
So maybe that's to be expected. I mean, I think there is evidence that in the West we have experienced what many have referred to as the Gramscian march through the institutions. So there has been a militantly secularist movement that has increasingly infiltrated, and I know that sounds conspiracy theory.
Well, it's captured. I suppose it's captured.
But that has just captured the institutions. So even when those structures are still there, they're almost a source of embarrassment. And so for example, most Cambridge colleges have a chapel. So this, the Christian nature of these institutions, the contemplative heart of these institutions is physically there. I mean, they almost all have a chapel in their midst, and yet there's often a sense of embarrassment about this, as if this is something that has to be justified. In fact, I mean, Cambridge is an interesting case here because, and the same applies to Oxford, because there are two aspects of Cambridge that are very interesting in the sense that neither of them fit in with the sort of technocratic secularist culture, but which I think are profoundly human and profoundly creative. And these two aspects are the table, so the common table, and the chapel.
Yes.
So most colleges have a hall and a common dining area where the teaching staff and the students eat together.
Yeah.
Now that practice of the common meal is a profoundly human experience.
Yeah.
And I think it's no accident that that many religious rituals, I mean, the Christian Eucharist is perhaps the most famous, but of course there's, in Judaism and in other religious traditions, you have a similar holy meal.
Yes.
And I think that is articulating something about this overlap of a visceral human experience closely aligned to our animal nature. Obviously, eating is perhaps the most important part of our lives. I mean,
it is, yes.
By
far,
Arche Freud, much more important than sex, because without food, nothing else is going to happen.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah. So it's interesting that should be institutionally so important. And then the other aspect of the chapel, because like it or not, we are very strange animals. And I would say that this contemplative sense of the sacred is, again, another primordial aspect of human nature that is lost in secular organizations, but is there in this archaic institution like a Cambridge College.
Yes.
So now, ironically, these colleges are, surprisingly effective as academic institutions, despite the fact that they have these utterly archaic structures. I mean, you would have thought that the best way to enhance their productivity would be to remove these, medieval
rituals,
structures and replace them with some, efficient canteen and change the chapel into a gymnasium or something.
Or like a gaming room or something.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. So I think these are paradoxes, I think, which are linked to the to a point that Charles Taylor, I think, makes very well, that the narrative of secularization is overly simplistic.
Yes. And reductionist, it just reduces everything. So, okay, this is good that you're talking about education, because I was trying to find it while you were talking, but there's a book written by a guy named Patrick Deneen. He's from University of Notre Dame here. And I said, do you know who Patrick Deneen is?
The name rings a bell, but I
He's a political philosopher. He wrote a book called Why Liberalism Failed several years ago that got really popular. And he's sort of part of the political stream of post-liberalism. And in his book, he writes about education, and he writes about sort of why these institutions were created. And he started quoting a lot of these in the United States, especially their founding statements. You have like Yale and Harvard and all these different founding statements that are really focused on, cultivating character and creating godly young men to go out and serve in civil society or in the church. And that's not happening anymore, as far as I can tell. That's not really the mission and purpose of the institutions. And I've wondered, I've heard a lot of discussion around what the purpose of the university is. What's the purpose of education generally, and then the purpose of the university? And it seems like it comes down to two different ways of thinking. And I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about this. One group says, well, the purpose of education is sort of you receive information, and then you as an individual decide what information or sort of what worldviews you're going to align with. So you get all the options, and then you decide. And then I hear other people who I tend to agree with a little bit more that says, well, the purpose of education is indoctrination, in the sense that part of the definition of the word education is indoctrination, in which you're trying to form and build somebody up into a type of person that can be sort of a civil and good and upright and righteous person in accordance with, I think, Scripture, the Bible, the truth. And so those are two different ways of doing things. When I think about my kids, we're going to homeschool because I don't really trust the systems here in Madison, Wisconsin. How would you say, like, what do you think is the best way to educate people? Because I think that's sort of one of the core questions, because education is linked to discipleship. It's linked to parenting. It's linked to, human flourishing. Which route would you take when it comes to education? Which route do you take when it comes to education?
Well, I think education is about prejudice and discrimination.
Interesting. Okay.
I'm being deliberately provocative there, of course.
I was like, okay, I've never heard that before. I've never heard that one. No, but elaborate. Tell me what you mean.
So, discrimination is key in the sense that, of course, I don't mean in the sense of the DEI sense of discrimination. I mean, we know from the way that the mind works that the mind has to be extremely selective.
Yes. Yeah.
otherwise your mind cannot cope with the blooming, buzzing overload of data that it encounters.
Yeah.
So the mind is naturally discriminating. I mean, that is, one of the themes of Immanuel Kant, that we don't just read information off from the world, but our experience of the world is already conceptualized and necessarily so. So the mind is quite properly and naturally interpreting its data selectively. It has to. And I think this fits in with cognitive science, that the cognitive scientists will tell you that the mind is extremely selective. And I think this applies to education, right? So one of the poisonous and damaging aspects of the left-wing ideology that has come to dominate in a number of the institutions in the West has been the idea that all the achievements of Western culture were the product of privilege and power, and particularly the privilege and power of white men. So what we have to do is repair that by going to the other extreme and
getting rid of white men.
Right. Getting rid of white men, basically. Yeah. So, I mean, the joke was that to become a head of a Cambridge college in the 1950s or 60s, you had to be a Marxist or a Freudian, and preferably both. I would say if you want to become a head of a Cambridge house at the moment, I think you'd be, you should be a woman or a Muslim, and preferably both. So again, this is this idea that somehow there's a higher justice in positively excluding those that have been unfairly dominating our culture for centuries. Now, what this does is, of course, is a road to ruin, it seems to me, and fails to recognize that there has been a justification for the continuity of esteem that we have held for some of the great writers, some of the great texts. And obviously in the Christian tradition, we have to have some justification for holding the texts of the Christian scriptures in esteem, even though these are texts that were composed however they were composed, and let's bracket those questions about inspiration, the nature of inspiration and whatever, but obviously before the discovery of DNA or gravity or Copernicus. So, why is it that we still read with reverence these texts that predate a number of discoveries about the nature of reality, which if you took a simplistic, positivistic view of the world, you would say would disqualify these texts straight away. And yet we believe that we should learn from these texts. They still speak to us, and that they have an authority. And I would say to a lesser degree, but there's a parallel here, similar things apply to Dante or to Shakespeare, or for that matter, Goethe. I mean, I disagree with Goethe on a number of issues. I'm sure I disagree with Dante as well. But the fact is that we learn from these figures, and the ideological lie that the prestige of these authors is merely some fantastic conspiracy of the patriarchy
Yes.
is I think just stupid beyond belief. But
It is.
so that's what I mean by discrimination. That there's a reason why you encourage students to study the great authors, not some latest fad that may well be of very little intrinsic significance and people will forget about in a couple of decades. So that sense of discrimination, and that's also what I meant about prejudice. I mean, Edmund Burke talks about prejudice with reason involved. Again, the mind is not a tabula rasa. It's not a clean slate. We have to train our children to be able to appreciate beauty and goodness and truth. Now, a lot of that involves training, just as, to give a perhaps rather relatively trivial example, but I'm sure as a father, I mean, your children are quite young at the moment, so it's not so urgent, but as they're getting older, I imagine that you will want to wean them off the fatty, sugary foods that almost all of us like because of, and I certainly do, for evolutionary reasons, right? I mean, our ancestors for millennia were driven by the longing for fruit and red meat and whatever. But you'll want to try to encourage your children to have a healthy diet and to also to have a taste for foods that may take a bit of time to appreciate, but when they do appreciate those foods, that'll be better for them. And I think my parallel would be with books and with music that you want to open their eyes to aspects of life which perhaps require a training. For many of these things, you need an education in the sense of a drawing out, a training, some sort of process in which the child can, after a period of time, say, yes, X is better than Y,
Right. Yes.
And when the child has, read a long, difficult novel discussing maybe religious and personal themes, to recognize that is a work of art in a way that some cartoon-like cheap thriller is not. So I think that these factors of discrimination and prejudice developing judgment is a very important part of the educational process, and part of that is linked to tradition.
Yes.
So that's what I meant by the fact that we're not creatures who, much to the annoyance, I think, of the technocrats, come from nowhere and could happily exist in any place or time. We are historical creatures. And this is where I think the imagination is important. since our minds are profoundly shaped by the imagination, and the imagination is determined to a considerable extent, paradoxically, by memory, we are necessarily historical creatures.
Sure.
Automatically.
So can you real quick define the imagination for people? Just because I know, average people don't necessarily think in the same terminology. And I know that the word has been defined in multiple different ways. So when you say the imagination, what exactly do you mean by that? I know that's anyways, yeah, go ahead. Because in your book, you kind of mentioned how there's a multitude of ways of looking at the imagination. So there's the impossible question.
I think what I'm ultimately, there are many aspects to this, but ultimately what I'm getting at in the book is something akin to what the French scholar and great expert on Muslim mysticism, Islamic mysticism, Henri Corbin, talks about as the mundus imaginalis, or the imaginal world.
Yes.
Now, what's interesting about this idea of the imaginal world is that it is not a fantasy world. It's the world in which certain symbols express eternal truths in a way that concepts, in the everyday sense of concepts, cannot.
For example, tell me if this is an example, but the cross would be the most popular one ever, probably. So that makes sense. So yeah. Anyways,
there are other aspects of imagination, of course, that I think there's I would want to distinguish between fantasy and imagination, and again, it comes back to a theological dimension here, because interestingly, in terms of the etymology of the word, so imagination obviously draws upon the word for image, and that language of the image. This is something I discuss a bit in my book, The Iconic Imagination.
Yes.
Here there's a tradition which is grounded in the idea that the human being is made in the image of God. Now, this is a doctrine that has been under, I would say, profound critique since the Enlightenment, and particularly after Darwin. If we are descended from animals, from other mammals, what does it mean to talk about human beings as being created in the image of God?
What is dignity?
That's pie in the sky.
Right.
Now, I would say against that if you believe in an omnipotent God, then it's perfectly reasonable to accept that God has his way of working. And so one can quite happily accept the scientific evidence of evolution and yet see the basis of the whole process of creation and the history of the created order as being grounded in divine activity and indeed divine providence. And if we look at the human being, then I think we have to note that the human animal is a very strange animal indeed.
Yeah.
And one of the strangest aspects of our lives as mammals is precisely what we're doing now. And that's in the first few lines of John's Gospel.
Yes.
I.e. the Logos,
Yes.
the language.
I was just going to bring that up. Thank you. Thank you, because that's the verse that just got me stuck as a kid. What on earth is John 1:1 talking about? And nobody ever explained it to me. And so I spent the last several years trying to figure it out. And it seems to me like in the discussion surrounding what it means to be made in the image of God, obviously there are a multitude of different aspects of the human person that are reflective of God, and we're made in the image in a multitude of ways. But it seems like the central point is the ability to use language to communicate and to create, which is, I think, directly tied to John 1:1, and that the Logos is the nature of Christ. Why is that? I never heard anybody say that, and maybe this is just because I grew up in a progressive city, but I never even hear Christians talk about the significance of the Logos. Like, why is that?
Well, let me give you a sort of fancy pants theological answer to that.
Okay, good.
Good. Which is, I can mention it and then we can forget about it almost straight away. And that's historically, Logos theologies were associated with subordinationism.
Interesting.
Right? So some of the great fathers of the church in Alexandria, like Origen, had explicit theologies of the Logos. And some of these theologians were prior to the Council of Nicaea and the doctrine that Christ is consubstantial with the Father. And so one of the reasons for a decline in an explicit Logos theology was the idea that somehow the Logos theology was tied to an idea of Christ being somehow subordinate to the Father, and so incompatible with Nicene Chalcedonian orthodoxy. But I'm only going to mention that en passant. I'm not going to really. I don't really think it's worth our discussing that. But I mean, some might be interested in that.
That is interesting. Yeah.
I mean, what's interesting here again, I think, is the semantic range of that word logos. Right? I mean, this is one reason why teaching languages is important in schools, is because translation is not always straightforward, and sometimes it's very complicated indeed.
Yeah.
Now, that word logos has a variety of meanings that can't be captured by the English word.
Right.
And, from intelligibility, proposition, word, intelligible energy. I mean, this whole range. I mean, again, when a philosopher in antiquity is using the word logos, and it's an important word for a number of philosophers, Stoic and Platonic, you have to look at the context in which they're using it. So it's a polyvalent term. But I think it's very interesting in terms of the question of language, because the human use of language and the capacity for language, I would say, is one of the best arguments for this idea of human beings being made in the image of God.
Yeah.
Because there's no parallel in the animal kingdom.
Right.
So our closest kin in the animal kingdom, so chimps, bonobos, and whatever, they don't have the physical capacity to produce anything like the range of sounds that we can create through language.
Unless you watch Planet of the Apes, Then
Yeah,
they
but-
developed.
well,
In
there's a
real
lot
life,
of
no.
imagination there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. But so then there are other animals that can produce a wide range of sounds,
Mm-hmm.
like birds, but of course they don't have the brains or the
Yes.
so the phenomenon of language is really remarkable.
Mm.
And not just in terms of obviously the sounds, but the depth grammar and the recursive capacities
Sure.
available through language, right? I mean, so for example, the fact that your children will be learning a highly complex language like English very quickly indeed
Mhm.
has suggested to some linguists, famously Noam Chomsky, that there must be innate powers in the mind, in the human mind, that facilitate the acquisition of a language like English at the speed that children do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that is suggesting that the gap between the data input and the capacity for the child to acquire an operational knowledge of the language
Yes.
is suggestive of a really extraordinary and indeed Chomsky would argue innate
Yes.
capacity for language.
Can I give a practical example of this?
Well, let's say, I mean, let's think of it in terms of basic language acquisition. So
Sure.
you could imagine an animal grunting
Yeah.
in relation to food or barking in relation to a predator.
Yes.
But there we've got a straightforward item response relationship.
Yes.
Now, what your children will be doing, and I mention yours because mine are 30 and 28, so they're a bit beyond it. But is that soon, or maybe already, I don't know, they are able to construct a vast array of sentences on the basis of their knowledge of grammatical structures.
Yes.
So on the basis of these structures and rules, they can then adapt to an incredible array of different contexts.
So can I give? Okay, so this just happened literally yesterday with our 2-year-old, and it's kind of a funny story. Just to, I guess, add to what you're saying a little bit. Give an example. Titus is his name, our son. He is putting sentences together and things like that. And so yesterday, and I don't know where he heard this, probably from me, and I have to watch my mouth around my kids. But yesterday, he noticed that the garbage can was a little bit overflowing and I needed to take the garbage out. And so he pointed at the garbage can and he said, "Take that crap out, Daddy." He said, take that crap out, Daddy. And I was like, okay. Who said that? Did I say that? But it was just, I told my wife, I was like, Titus just told me to take that crap out. So I got to go do that. But it's like fascinating. I know that, I'm like, okay, I got to not say crap around him, but it's fascinating. But that's the example, maybe a funny example of just at 2 years old, able to sort of put that all together and tell me, like, it's time to take the garbage out, it's overflowing. And it obviously you're not seeing that with any other, not a dog or a chimpanzee or anything like that, which is really, really interesting because there is something that is part of our nature that's related to language. I was going to ask you about Genesis 11, which I haven't seen. I've tried to look into commentary on Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. And there's one sentence in particular that always strikes me. as very interesting that I don't see a lot of good theological commentary, and maybe I just am not looking in the right places. But when God comes down and he's looking at everything and he's a little bit like, okay, there's a problem here. And he says something interesting. He says, now that they all share one language, there's nothing they can't do. And so obviously his punishment, or his, I guess the way that he solves that problem is by dispersing the languages, and now they can't create and build with the same capacity. And like, so God himself says that now that they have one language, there's nothing they can't do. That's like a really interesting thing for God to say. I don't know. And I just don't hear anybody talk about that. And it feels like the closest we've gotten to everybody on earth sharing one language has been sort of the spread of English over the past several hundred years. And we've created like spaceships and rockets and so what is that? Is there a relationship between sort of the continuity of language and creation and exploration, and that is related to the logos, related to being made in the image of God, I suppose, as everybody, if everybody on earth was using the same language in proper relationship with one another, I suppose it would mean that there just isn't anything that we can't do. Like, do you see it that way? Like, that's just an interesting thing. I just have never heard anybody talk about that, though.
Well, I think the Christian perspective, and since we're not Marcionites, right? So the Orthodox Christian view is to accept the Old Testament.
Yes. Yes.
Right. So Marcion being, just for the sake of your viewers, the early Christian who wanted to jettison the Old Testament.
Yes. Yeah. He saw two different gods, kind of, in some sense. Yeah. Right.
And I think the Christian perspective is distinctly different from the secular viewpoint, I'd say, in two respects. On the one hand, the image of God idea. So the Christian has a more elevated view of the human being than the secular humanist, who obviously regards the human being as just a more sophisticated ape.
Right.
But also the Christian view differs from the secular humanist view in the sense of human depravity.
Yeah.
So all traditional Christians, whether semi-Pelagian or hyper-Augustinian, so i.e. whatever your view about sin or predestination, all Orthodox Christians hold to a view of humanity, mankind, as fallen in some sense.
Yeah.
So I think the image of Babel is a narrative about our fallen nature.
Yes.
And I mean, it's an interesting experience with learning a language. So I'll give you a sort of rather trivial example, and this will probably be deeply offensive to a number of your viewers, but I'll mention it anyway. Okay. So I like Italian. It's a language that I don't particularly master. I don't. My German and French are much stronger than my Italian.
Sure.
But in some respects, I'd say Italian is my favorite language.
Okay.
But sometimes, because it's very close to Spanish, if I hear Spanish, I'll start to wonder whether I'm listening to Italian.
Sure.
And then I think, no, that's too ugly. It can't be.
Sure. Yes.
But the fact is that once you learn a language, you come to have a sense of its own internal properties and its own value, and maybe its own beauty.
Yes.
So I'm sure that my feeling of the ugliness of Spanish
Yes.
is my incapacity to hear it properly, to listen to it. Because it's unfamiliar to me. It's partly familiar through Italian and Latin and whatever, but it's basically an unfamiliar language to me. So the disconnect between human beings, the lack of communication, I think, can be expressed through this story of Babel. But there's another interesting thing, it seems to me, about the Logos.
Yes.
Is the translatability of all human languages.
That's interesting.
I mean, notwithstanding how very different languages are that we know of,
right.
The basic assumption, and if you find a philologist who can correct me on this, then please, I'd be interested to know. I mean, I think the basic assumption of all philology is that all languages are translatable.
Yes.
So, however peculiar one language might seem from the perspective of another, so, for example, there are languages where the gender aspect is much more evident than in others. So, in English, we, can talk to each other without it being clear that I'm speaking to a male and you're speaking to a male.
Yes.
But there are languages where even very simple sentences would make it clear that we're speaking, male to male, and the
Spanish,
sentences would have a different grammatical structure if it were otherwise.
Right.
Now, so there are aspects that can seem like strange differences, even in fairly cognate languages. They can be much more dramatic in more remote languages, but nevertheless, the basic assumption is the translatability.
Yes.
Now, that seems to be there in this notion of the logos, which is both the word, but also the intelligibility. So we are assuming that however weird another culture is, right?
Yeah.
And that nevertheless there's a common humanity there. There's a common logos.
Yes.
I mean, I was reading today about an account of some missionary who was killed going to a very remote island in the Indian Ocean.
Wow.
I mean, some of these history of missionaries going to very remote parts of the world and frankly, very dangerous parts of the world.
Yes.
But nevertheless, with that assumption that these are human beings who deserve to hear the gospel of Christ is, whatever you think about missionary activity or the role of Christianity in the world.
I think it's good. I think it's very good.
No, I'm not. I'm just saying, I'm bracketing that for the moment. I mean, the point I'm making is a philosophical one.
Yes.
Right? That this is assuming that however alien or strange the community or the society, you are dealing with human beings and you can explain to them.
Yeah. Wow.
You can translate.
And this is evidence to me, I guess, as you're saying it, I've never really thought about it until now. The translatability of all these languages is evidence. I think it points towards an objective reality.
Yes, of course.
Right. And it's sort of an indictment against postmodernism, would you say?
Yeah. Yes, of course. Yes.
That's very interesting. And that's actually very interesting. Now, I want to go a step further with that, because as you were talking, I was thinking about, okay, is the translatability of all these languages evidence of the diverse nature of God or evidence of the fallen nature of man? Thinking about the story of Babel, in that God disperses the languages and that the unified language is the thing that they started out with. Do you think, and obviously you've never been to heaven, so, I guess we'll figure this out later on, but do you think that in heaven there will be one shared language, or do you think that there will be a multitude of diverse languages? Like, do you think that the diversity in language is a result of the fall, or do you think that it's kind of an image of God's diverse nature himself? And I suppose, we'll start there. Do you think that in heaven there will be multiple languages?
Before I answer that, could I just say that Derrida's idea of the infinite deferral of meaning and his critique of logocentrism, is pertinent here.
Yes.
Right? So a lot of postmodern culture is based on the critique of the idea of the logos.
Yeah.
I mean, precisely to reinforce what I think is an unsustainable relativism.
Yes. Yes. So that's absolutely okay. That's helpful. So then do you think, because I've been trying to figure this out, because I've been trying to figure out what sort of impact postmodernism has actually had on our culture. Like because we see it everywhere. I think I see postmodernism all over the place, not just in the simplicity of you have your views and I'll have my views, but even in the way that we think and talk about like almost anything, any conversation that I'm having with somebody, there's always this sense of, everything's subjective. You kind of do your thing, I'll kind of do my thing. And yet that's made its way into the church. And I think it's in America, at least, is causing this. It just feels like internal chaos. And I think it has to do with why a lot of churches in the United States are really struggling. I actually just did a podcast with a reporter talking about the new Pew research that came out that said that almost every denomination within Protestantism is on the decline. It has been for 20 years in the U.S. And
I think that wasn't helped by the COVID and the very strange lockdown situation.
Right. It was not helped at all. But I also don't think it's helped by the fact that I'm going to just talk about the evangelicals, because I think that that's what I know most about, have tried so hard to include the culture, to sort of adapt to the culture, without recognizing that the culture's presupposition is this postmodern relativism that is totally contradictory to Christ himself. And you can't reconcile that. So they keep trying, and then people leave the church because it's just weird. They get in there and they're like, believe in the authority of Christ, believe in the authority of the Bible. And then, but language and words have no fundamental meaning, and we need to do with the culture. So you're like, wait, what does this all mean? It's very confusing. Is that analysis accurate, do you think? Am I seeing something that's real?
Yes. I mean, apparently there's a phenomenon in Scandinavia of converts among intellectuals in the Nordic countries from either a secular position or Lutheranism to Roman Catholicism. And it's because they see, Roman Catholicism as offering an antidote to the contemporary secular humanist culture.
I think that's happening. I mean, because Catholicism was the only form of Christianity that had an uptick in the Pew research. So they're on the rise a little bit, and nobody else is. And Protestants have done, and I've tried to say this for the last year or two. I've noticed people are moving into Catholicism. You'll have to tell me what you think about this. I'm Calvinist, so maybe I'm just being a hard-nosed jerk or something. But I feel like they're moving into Catholicism not necessarily because of the doctrines, but because of the continuity and the structure in which they're not feeling in the rest of their life. And I, as a Protestant, I love Martin Luther. I think that sola scriptura is real. I think that justification is by faith. And I think that the doctrines within sort of the core of the Protestant theology, I think those are correct. I think those are right. And I don't think that the Catholic understanding of justification is correct. I think that their understanding of human nature is incorrect as well. But when I talk to people and ask, why are you moving into Catholicism? Rarely is it because, well, I study the doctrine of justification and I came to the conclusion that the Catholics are right. No. And so they're just like, well, the Catholics seem to be making more sense. They seem to have a comprehensive worldview, one that includes politics and philosophy and theology. And the evangelicals are over here telling people, politics is disconnected from theology, and you can come to church on Sunday and your life can be different Monday through Saturday, and there's no continuity. And that structure is innate to what it means to be a human being. And so people are leaving what I think to be a truer doctrine for a lesser true doctrine, because the lesser true doctrine is encapsulated in a more structured and natural and good way of living. And does that? Sorry, I don't know if that makes sense.
I mean, what I suspect here, and again, I think this relates to a cultural problem.
Sure,
and that is the deliberate erosion or critique of tradition.
Yes.
And any healthy society is constituted by a polarity of tradition and innovation.
Sure.
But contemporary Western society has, I think for different reasons, partly to do with those factors I mentioned, the terrible wars and the guilt about those wars and
yes,
to some extent the Western imperialism, whatever, that this has led to a critique of tradition that is basically unsustainable. Goethe has a wonderful phrase where he says, children need roots and wings. And that, again, is another paradox of tradition.
Yes.
That, of course, tradition can be stifling.
Yeah.
But tradition can also be the basis and foundation for creativity and indeed for freedom.
Right. Well, that was the American Revolution, was rooted in I think a decent understanding of the Book of Exodus, which is a traditional thing. Yeah. And it's like, but what do you do about those paradoxes? Because I even think about, the irony in what you're saying to me is that fundamentally, the atomic bomb was not necessarily rooted in a traditional understanding of human nature and the nature of the world. Like, I don't think that Christianity, if somebody were to just start with the Bible, they would technologically, well, maybe I'm wrong about this, I don't know, they would technologically end in creating an atomic bomb or in what the future holds, which is like a transhumanist worldview. And so in some sense, something switched and flipped in the, what would it be, the 19th and 20th centuries, in which people still held to the view that Christian tradition was the dominating force in our presupposition, but in reality it was something different. Was it postmodernism? I don't know what it was that helped then create the, I guess, headway for this technological advancement that created the atomic bomb that then caused millions of deaths, which I believe was justified because I think the war would have continued to go on. I hope that I'm making sense. What I'm trying to say is, like, there's something paradox happened or something weird happened during that time period in which people were still under the assumption that we have a Christian presupposition, but that just wasn't. I don't think that is true of that time
Well,
period.
of course, Christianity has traditionally, since the story of Christ and the coin,
Yes.
Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's.
Yeah.
I mean, Christianity has a distinctive account of the relationship between the sacred and the secular.
Wow.
So Christianity can afford to allow a space for the sacred in a way that certain other religions can't.
Right.
And ironically, you could say that's one reason why the Enlightenment and modernity could develop in the Christian West
Yes.
in a way that it couldn't in other parts of the world.
Yes.
And also, we have the doctrine of, as I say, the fall. I mean, as far as I understand, and you probably know more about it than I do, but the decision to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was in part determined by the extraordinary resistance of the Japanese defending their homeland.
Yes. Yeah.
Against American troops. So
I think they were going to go until everybody died. I think that was
exactly. Yeah. But we have, I think, in our sort of secular cosmopolitan world, we have so deeply attacked the idea of loyalty and belonging and patriotism as either, well, at best, crypto-fascist, but or at worst, straightforwardly.
Yes.
So, and again, this is another part of human nature that, of course, can be perverted, but that sense of belonging is perfectly natural and healthy.
Yes.
And that's, I think, obviously one reason why for the certain developments in politics in recent months, shall we say.
Yes. Well, one of the ridiculous things that has happened in the evangelical world in my lifetime is, and it's to the exact point that you're making about this. I heard growing up that patriotism is bad. Patriotism, is fascist or whatever. Or if you're a Christian and you want your country to maybe be a little bit more Christian, that you're a Christian nationalist and you're going to kill everybody who's not a Christian or something. Like that's what I heard growing up. Like that was sort of the rhetoric. And then the evangelical church in America sort of just bent the knee to that. And they were like, okay, well, we're going to take some of these verses in scripture that talk about being citizens of heaven, and we're just going to basically detach ourselves from reality. I mean, not full, detach ourselves from the world that we live in and just say, we're just citizens of heaven. We don't need to engage in the civil commerce, in politics and stuff. We're going to step away from that. And they've done that. And as a result, they've been coerced into, well, they've done that, but then what takes over then is sin nature. So they've been, I think, coerced into then voting for people, in my opinion, who are immoral and who want immoral policy, pro-abortion, pro-transgenderism policy that is out of line with Christianity. And because they didn't take a stand on some of these issues of abortion and transgenderism and things like that, and because they detached themselves from the political world that they lived in, now they're in this situation in which they're trying to justify that stance. And you go to a non-denominational evangelical church in America right now, especially in the north of America, and you will not hear any discussion about abortion, which I think is the greatest injustice ever perpetrated by any civilization. And you won't hear much about transgenderism. You'll actually hear a lot of these churches that are just in favor of that because they don't know how to reconcile the fact that they didn't stand up against it and recognize that they lived in a political world, and you have to engage with the political world as a Christian. Just because your citizenship is in heaven eternally doesn't mean that God hasn't put you here in America today to engage with the world around you. I know you said before we started talking that you rarely talk politics because it's reductionistic and not as interesting. And I totally understand that. But what do you...
Sorry, I didn't, if I can just
Sure.
qualify that. So
Yeah.
what I'm objecting to is the transmutation of all intellectual, cultural debate into politics.
Yes. Okay.
And that is, I think, a particular agenda to say that, which is basically coming from Hobbes or Machiavelli, or more recently, Michel Foucault, to say that everything is power, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so any discussion about apparently innocent or purely speculative or issues must be or is in fact the camouflaging of particular power interests, and they should be exposed.
Sure.
So that's what I meant, really.
Sure.
I wasn't denying that these political questions are important. I was just referring to the fact that in the last week or two, when I've been discussing Goethe's Faust or Schelling talking about human and divine freedom, the students have responded to that with enthusiasm, it seemed to me, quite regardless of whether they vote Democrat or Republican, or whether they believe in decolonization, or what their views are about human biology and gender. I think there's a real appetite for these metaphysical questions about the nature of human beings, our vocation, and transcendence, the relationship of transcendence to immanence. I mean, these absolutely core questions, the status of Scripture, more conservative or liberal views about Scripture, or even questions like the role of tradition in a fast-moving society like the United States of America. I mean, these are questions that are not simply issues about power politics. They are genuine questions of inquiry.
Sure. Yeah. And that, I mean, I understand. I totally get that. I wonder, do you, and I maybe I'll be a little contrarian right now. I don't, because I intuitively have thoughts about what you just said. So do you, I'll give you my thoughts. You can tell me if you think that I'm being contrarian for no reason. I don't know if I would view that as a positive, that these young people are responding well, regardless of what political or philosophical presuppositions they might have, because it seems to me like these old writers. I even think of like the thing that just came out this last week. I don't know if you saw this, at the Chronicles of Narnia is being made by Netflix, and that they're in talks with Meryl Streep about being Aslan, right? So that's a problem, turning Aslan into a woman, right? That's crazy, obviously. And C.S. Lewis is like, if he was alive, he obviously would absolutely hate that because it's evil and it's just horrible distortion of what he actually wrote and the truth of Aslan being representative of Christ. Okay, so that seems to me to be what happens when you detach some of these things. I get that these people that you're talking to are enthusiastic, and I think that's good. But if the enthusiasm only goes so far as to the conversation or abstract thinking about these things, but not into the practical real life implication of the application of these things, of these ideas, then to me, and I'm seeing this in academia. I'm not a major academic myself, but I interview a lot of professors and stuff. And sometimes I'll ask questions about, practical, how does this practically apply to the world politically, or not even politically, just in everyday life? And there's some sort of disconnect. It's like, well, that's fun thinking about, but go ahead.
Okay. Let me come back to you. So there's an ancient Latin adage for an orator,
sure,
where a speaker is worried about, what to say. And the adage is, rem tene verba ipsa sequentur. So grasp the thing, the words themselves will follow. I.e., if you've grasped your subject matter, the articulation of the ideas will follow naturally.
Sure.
I think the same is true vis-a-vis theory and practice.
Yeah, okay.
So if you've grasped certain truths, then the practical dimension will flow from it.
Yes.
And so here's what I think about the Meryl Streep and Aslan.
Yes, tell me.
I suspect that there is a conscious anti-theological agenda lying behind a lot of the postmodern deconstruction of Western culture, Eurocentrism, the patriarchy, etc., etc. And I say this because just as I believe that this sense of the sacred is a primordial aspect of human experience, that is also linked to the division between male and female.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So the difference and indeed the polarity of male and female is one of the great mysteries of human experience.
Yes.
And to try to pretend to construct the lie that this is merely conventional, that Andy is a man because he has assumed a certain cultural indoctrination, and this has led him to walk in a particular way and to, wear facial hair, or I don't know.
Whatever I do. Let's be more aggressive or something.
Yes, exactly. This convention of masculinity is, apart from being, of course, biologically absurd. I mean, it's worse than the biological lie that you can change from being XX to XY or XY to XX. I mean,
you think,
the fact of the matter is that we are biologically binary, that the whatever the chemical or surgical changes you might undergo, you're never going to change your chromosomal structure.
Yes.
But there's I think if from a Christian perspective, there is a profound aspect of the created order. That, God made mankind male and female. And this is such a profound aspect of our phenomenology, our experience as human beings. It's such a profound aspect of let us say, the symbolism that I would say is not just an array of arbitrary phantasmata, but those symbols like my Father in heaven, or the divine wisdom, which, by the way, is often feminine.
Interesting. Yeah. In Proverbs, right?
Proverbs, exactly. So, and if you think about the whole tradition of lady philosophy, when Boethius is in his cell as a Christian philosopher, he's going to be executed, and his conversation is with the divine wisdom, with lady philosophy. It's Beatrice who is leading Dante to heaven, and Goethe himself says that the eternal feminine raises us up. So the profound mystery of what one might call the polarity of male and female, which is grounded in the symbolism of our inherited tradition, is, I think, so fundamental that the attempt to destroy or deconstruct this mystery must be ultimately theological.
Yes. Yeah. So what happens though? That's my question, is like, what's going to happen? And then can you be you don't have to do this, but can you be a prophet and just like tell me, because this is not like, this is practically happening, kids. I mean, as kids are being told that they're the opposite gender than what they are. I've even heard in my hometown, they do pride parades for 6-year-olds at some public schools, and coming out parades, and 6-year-olds. It's like at 6, you shouldn't even have any concept of sort of your sexual desire. I mean, unless something horrible has happened to these kids. And so it's terrible. And so, like, what's going to come of that, though?
This is interesting, I think. And
yes.
So, when I talk about the mystery of the polarity between male and female, of course, this is in many ways a complex polarity.
Yeah.
Not just because we all have mothers and some of us have sisters, and but also because the relationship between the male and the female is complicated by very occasional exceptions biologically.
Yes. Yeah.
And which are, I think, do deserve to be treated with great compassion and care by Christians. Yes. There's no doubt about that.
Grace. Yeah.
And much more commonly, complications in terms of orientation, maybe sexual orientation, or indeed psychological orientation.
Yes.
Now, it would seem that children often navigate some of these, as it were, borders naturally in terms of their play.
Yes.
So it's, the classic instance of girls being tomboys, for example.
Yes. Yeah.
Or, little boys on stage in Elizabethan theatre playing young women. So there's always been within our tradition as it were, a institutionalized recognition of some of these, let's say, to use the dreadful modern language, fluidities, right?
Yeah. Right.
But they were held within certain boundaries. And I've come across some of this material through my work on play, that there's a strange paradox about play, and this is the following, that the serious adult is usually the adult who was able to play as a child. If you remove the capacity for a child to play, and this apparently applies to other mammals, they will become very disturbed adults.
Yes.
So now there's this very interesting work by Jonathan Haidt and his colleagues, about, the coddling of the Western mind and the lack of a certain play culture in Western civilization, where because of fear of abductions and whatever, children were kept inside, they weren't allowed to play. So, and he thinks that, if I understand his argument correctly, that the fragility of a lot of young adults in the Western world is directly linked to this failure to play as children. And there would seem to be a parallel here with the exponential growth of, let's say, gender fluidity among adults, with the incapacity to play as children, possibly linked to changing social structures, single parent homes, insecurity at home. So the thought would seem to be, if you don't give a child security in that crucial child phase and the capacity to play that goes along with the security of that childhood phase, this will be deferred into the adult phase where it's quite inappropriate.
Yes.
Because frankly, an adult, we have there's a famous artist in Britain, Grayson Perry, who likes to dress up as a woman, and there's another famous comedian who does this. Well, from a certain perspective, this may look very progressive and edgy.
Sure.
But I think it just looks puerile. And so there, I think we have an instance of this. Maybe artists are extreme cases anyway. Maybe in many artists you have the prolongation of a childlike tendency that expresses itself in other ways as well. And I don't want to be too critical of these eccentric characters, but maybe it's quite right that they are eccentric and they shouldn't be held up as paradigms for the majority of society. And so I just wanted to raise that peculiar paradox of play and the serious adult.
Yes. Well, that's actually really interesting. As a parent living in the United States, I do feel that tension with our kids, because I'm like, the world isn't what it was, because of the rise of the internet and all the secret stuff happening on the internet. A lot of children are coerced into this sort of crazy worldview, progressive worldview that is destructive for them. And then, if we're being honest, like there are a lot more pedophiles in the West, or like just statistically. And so you have your kids, and you're like, when I was a kid, my parents would just go to the park, like, go do something with your friends. And we'd just go like bike around the town and, get into trouble. Not too much, but whatever. And then now I'm like, I don't know if I want my kids just out and about, and obviously not at 2 years old, but even as they get older by themselves, because people have gotten really, crime is up and people have gotten really bad because of this lack of theological grounding in our culture, and this postmodern presupposition and this Marxist sort of power structures that everybody believes in. But
isn't there a backlash, particularly in the US?
There's a little bit.
The recent hoo-ha about Snow White.
Yeah, that's true.
Why you would choose a Latina actress as Snow White any more than you would choose a blonde or a redhead?
Yes.
The whole point of Snow White is that she has raven black hair and skin like snow. She's
right. There is a backlash a little bit, and so Francis Schaeffer. Do you know Francis Schaeffer? He was a Christian philosopher from mid to late 20th century. He wrote this book, How Should We Then Live?, where he talks about the West, and he makes the argument that Reformed Christianity built the West, whatever. At the end of it, he talks about the future. So he writes this in like 1970s, and he talks about what's coming down the pipeline. And I think he totally gets it accurate. And I kind of blew my mind because I was like, how could he know this, 50 years ago? And he talks about how culture is going to devolve into having two sorts of primary values, and those primary values being personal peace and affluence. And so people are going to sort of live and vote for and structure society to uphold those two values. So personal peace just being kind of stay away from me, I don't trust people, sort of, and then affluence being money and accumulating goods and materialism. And so my question, as you said, there's sort of a backlash. I think that there is, and there was backlash to the transgenderism stuff, but the big question for me is that backlash due to an actual good sort of Christian objective we don't want the world to be this way because it's morally wrong? Or is it because they feel that those sorts of ideologies are encroaching on their personal peace and affluence, which are their two primary value systems? So do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think the reason why, I think the upset about Disney is interesting.
Yes.
And I think it's linked to the success of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien.
Even though Tolkien did not like Walt Disney, he did not like Disney.
No, yes, okay, yes, no, I know, but in a way, Disney and Hollywood traditionally have relied upon mythic and symbolic structures and materials.
Yes.
Right.
Pinocchio.
And of course, I think the actress in the new Snow White, who's been, involved in all the controversy. Yeah. I think part of the reason she got into trouble is she said, it's not a love story, and the prince isn't important. This is about a young woman being empowered and whatever.
Yeah.
Well,
it's like, okay, that's not the story, but yeah.
But it's not, because you could say, well, okay, that's, people are just irritated because that's not the story.
Sure,
and, but I think it's deeper than that.
Yes.
I think it is, it's this attack on the mystery of what it is to be a woman.
Yeah.
The mystery of what it is to be a man.
Yes.
And obviously there are crude and perverted versions of both of these. But I think we have a very rich inheritance of the meaning of femininity or masculinity through a literary, theological, and symbolic inheritance, partly through fairy tales, partly through legends, and which explore a lot of the dangers and the dark side, so Lancelot and Guinevere as much as Snow White and her prince, so the temptations, the failings, etc. Now, what I think is at work here, which I think is quite interesting, is the attempt to subvert that symbolic imaginary. And the reason why this is dangerous is because, as I've argued in Living Forms of the Imagination and in other books, is that this symbolic imaginary is not just one imaginary alongside a lot of other possibilities. It is ultimately grounded in truth. And so I think part of the resistance is indeed Christian. I mean, it may be submerged, but I think it is linked to the public and financially supported attempt to subvert part of the Christian narrative.
Yes, it is, and it seems like that's what the future seems like. It's like, it doesn't seem like they're going to stop, which I understand. Like their worldview, we sort of did the Pandora's box thing, I feel like, with postmodernism, in which we open that up. And I don't know if that can all be that can totally be stopped at this point. I don't know that prior to Industrial Revolution, world wars, and the 20th century, the concept of postmodernism or the philosophy of postmodernism would have been so widespread in a world in which a tornado could just not even a tornado, like a hurricane would just wipe out an entire town. We didn't have, nature imposed itself historically on people, and so that sort of presupposition of the mimetic worldview was it wasn't even sort of questioned until we began to create things that could kind of withstand some of that, the nature's imposing reality on human beings. And once that happened, people, I think the social imaginary changed from a mimetic to poetic. And when so now that that's been sort of let out and everybody believes in that, it seems like the future is only going to go towards a transhuman future, in which, because you can't change, to what you're saying, you can't change the reality, the foundation of reality. You can't make gender what it isn't. You can't make human beings what they aren't. You can, though, fake it in some sense with technology. And video games do this, or VR does this in some sense. You can fake it. And so when you attach humanity to technology in that sort of way, and you create alternate realities, fake realities, but still, they seem real to people, and you get a world in which it looks like, the movie WALL-E. I don't know if you've seen that with the little robot, where all the people are like sitting on these chairs. They're like super fat. They're always on screens. They don't live for anything. They just are doing whatever's on the screen. And it's this counterfeit reality that's obviously not real. But I think, I that's why I'm a little bit nervous of AI, because it doesn't feel like AI, there's any sort of hey, is this bad? Should we be doing this? Should we be creating a system that can? And I know that we're past time here, but I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that before we wrap things up? That the future moving towards transhumanism is inevitable? Am I just a pessimistic person who needs to lighten up a little bit, or what do you think about that?
Well, I suppose Nietzsche, with his idea of the Superman, was, I suppose you could see as a peculiar kind of prophet of transhumanism.
Sure.
I suppose I'd link it to very ancient fantasies of the sort of Faustian kind. Some of our limitations and our frailties are very difficult to accept.
Yes. Yeah.
And it often seems to me that there's a significant difference between our ancestors and contemporary culture in the sense that one of the problematic aspects of contemporary culture is the idea that happiness is the default. And if you're unhappy, there must be something wrong with you.
Yeah.
And maybe some mental health support, or maybe some surgical support, or
medication,
drugs or whatever. But that will get you to being happy.
Yeah.
Whereas our ancestors had a much more tempered view of reality and understood that suffering is part of the human condition.
Yeah.
Christians as much as Buddhists, and that happiness is a very difficult task, and best thought of as a byproduct of a meaningful structure to your life.
Interesting.
So I think there is obviously a great deal of suffering among young people, which the virtual world doesn't help, and AI, I think, is complicating.
Yes. Yeah.
But I really don't see how solutions can be found through the technology.
I agree.
They must lie in the human heart, and in a spiritual dimension that cannot be captured or resolved through technology.
Yeah, I agree. And the people who, our culture struggles with Jesus, I think for that exact reason, that happiness is, Jesus, if you read his life, it's not the happiest life in the whole world. It's actually tragic, and he experienced
take up your cross.
Yes. Right. And but it's more meaningful. I mean, he did something that obviously impacted all of humanity for all of time. And to be a Christian is to take part in that sort of meaningful life. And so I think you're right. Technology is not going to solve that problem that people have in finding meaning and purpose in their life. I think it is in Christ and in his life, and then living like him, and believing in him. So, but we're at 2 hours, and so I'll wrap this up. Thanks for doing this. I mean, I feel like we talked about so many different things, and it's very helpful to just hear your thoughts on education and even transgenderism, and on whether or not Aslan should be a woman. Obviously he shouldn't. Yeah. It's like, I saw that. I was like, what are we doing, guys? Like, I love Narnia, and I'm one of the few people who think that I like Narnia more than I like Lord of the Rings. Not to pit them against each other, but I just think, Chronicles of Narnia are great. And so to see that is really disturbing. I don't want Aslan to be a woman because he's not. And so that's one problem. But anyways, thanks so much for doing this podcast. Seriously, appreciate having this conversation.
Well, pleasure, Andrew.
Yes.